Thank you very much. I'm very privileged, and it's a pleasure to be here today. So thank you for the invitation. A lot of what I would like to share with you today is based on research that I've been doing over the last 10 years, but more specifically over the last couple of years. So what I'd like to do this afternoon, I know I'm the only thing that stands between you and lunch, so I'll try to be brief, but I'd like to share a little bit about the research and the background, and then I'm actually going to turn it over to you and ask you what's your definition of brand. Because before we can actively manage our brands, we need to understand what kind of beast we're dealing with. So I'd like to be pretty interactive. And if at any time you want to ask a question, please go ahead and put up your hand. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about a paradigm shift that we've observed in the nonprofit sector as a whole, and try to invite you to think about where you might be on that paradigm shift. And then introduce you to the idea of the brand, or introduce you to the brand idea. And talking about brand and the management of brand through sort of 3 phases, looking at brand integrity, democracy, and affinity. And so we'll sort of unpeel or peel out what that actually means. But a lot of what I want to share with you is based on interviews with about 100 people in 70 different organizations. So we talked to nonprofit executives, communication directors, some academics, some consultants, but we really tried to interview a spectrum of organizations. So obviously there are a lot of nonprofit, both advocacy and service delivery organizations, but we also talked to a variety of foundations, large and small community foundations, and some large cap foundations like the Gates Foundation and the Rockefeller Foundation. We tried to look at organizations at different points in their life cycle. So some startup organizations, but other organizations that have been around for 10, 20, even 100 years. So we really tried to look at a spectrum of organizations, both in the US, but also I did a lot of interviews in China, as well as in Europe. So it's not a very scientific approach to the different cases, but we really tried to include a spectrum and a variety of organizations. And that resulted in two products, I would say. The first is an article in the Stanford Social Innovation Review, which Kirstine read and was the source of the invitation, and then a book that sort of follows up on our research, which is called The Brand Idea, which is the framework we had, and that really goes into more details in terms of some recommendations for how to manage your brand. So let me stop there and ask, what is a brand? It's not a rhetorical question. I'm actually, yep, go ahead.
It's what people say about you when you're not in the room.
Okay, all right, that's one concept of what people think, maybe, and say about you. Other ideas about what a brand is? No? Yeah?
It is something that everyone recognizes, then they knew exactly what you stand for. You accumulate all your values in the brand, so that you see the brand and then you have quite a nice idea of what it is.
Or a negative idea, depending on the brand. So it's this notion of an accumulation of ideas, perceptions, thoughts about what? What kind of entity? What has a brand? What kinds of things have brands? Yeah. Or you can just shout it out if it becomes too...
Companies, organizations have brands,
yes.
Product have brands, yes. And people have brands.
People have... So what doesn't have a brand?
Air, for example.
Air has no brand. Or, well, clean air, dirty air. So, yeah, pretty much everything has a brand. But I'm still trying to get at what is a brand. It's a set of ideas, a set of perceptions. What else might a brand be? How else would you define a brand? We talked about something that people say about you when you're not in the room. So it's akin to gossip. It's akin to perceptions. perceptions of values, perceptions of what you're going to expect when you interact with that brand. Other ideas? Yeah.
It's an asset.
Beautiful. It's an asset, right? It's an intangible asset because it's a set of ideas and perceptions, but it's definitely an asset. Do we carry it on our books? Do we carry it on our balance sheet? If it's an asset, it has value. Do we carry it on our books? Yes, we do. Sometimes it's called goodwill in the private sector, but we definitely carry it on our books. If it's an asset that has value, then we want to actively manage that and preserve that value, right? So there's some implications for how we think about what a brand is. So let me share maybe a few definitions. And one of the this is the American Marketing Association, not the Medical Association, but the American Marketing Association defines it as a series of things, a name, a symbol, some sort of visual elements that helps identify an organization or a person or even a country from another, distinct from others. So this notion of identification and distinct from others. And it goes back to something that Dr. Ten talked about in terms of positioning, right? It's relative to others. A brand stands relative to others. We talked about the notion of intangible asset. A lot of times we talk about a brand as a promise. We talk about the brand promise to deliver on a series of expectations, right? We have some expectations when we think about a particular brand, and sometimes those expectations are positive, sometimes they tend to be negative. This is what's really interesting to me. A brand is really a psychological construct. So that means it's just a set of ideas, thoughts, feelings, perceptions that resides in the mind of your brand audience. So having said that, who does the brand belong to then? We've said it's an asset, but given that it's a psychological construct held in the minds of our brand audiences, who does the brand belong to? This is important if we're trying to manage it. The company. Does it belong to the company? It's a psychological construct. So the trademark may belong to the company, but does the brand actually belong to the company or the foundation in this case? Ooh, usually my student says, well, it depends, because that's really a good way to sort of navigate that. No, it belongs to the audience. So I think it's important for us to remember that as we think about whether and how we manage that brand. People have also talked about the brand as sort of a reflection of the soul or the essence of an organization, who you are, who you truly are, and how that is connected to the values that are important to the organization. And I would say in our research, a lot of times a brand answers these three questions: who you are, what you do, and particularly in the nonprofit sector, why that's important. And so those three components, or the ability to answer those three questions, is really the job of the brand. There are also two dimensions to the brand. One is the internal brand identity. So this is how you yourself or your organization thinks about that question, who you are, what you do, why it's important. Sometimes that could be somewhat aspirational, but in any case, it is anchored in the mission and the values, both of which have been talked about in our previous discussions. So when I talk about mission, it could also be the charter, right? The foundation's charter, or the mission, the reason why the organization exists. And the values are really sort of a dimension of what's important, and then the brand image is the first definition we heard, which is the external perception, right? And so it's a little bit complicated because there's both this internal part of the brand identity, and then this external perception that's wrapped up in the brand image. And the key role or the key job of managing a brand is to make sure that there's alignment between those two. right? And so that's going to be one of the key targets that we had. And we already got to this. Everyone and everything has a brand. So that's sort of a brief kind of introduction and thinking about what the brand is. And now maybe I could ask you to reflect on, having defined what a brand is, how can we think about what job or what role the brand plays for an organization, both your own organization or other kinds of organizations? So what's the job of a brand? We realize it's an asset. It has those two dimensions of identity and image. What can a brand do for us? Why might it be important? Yeah, sir.
It's a multi-dimensional communication vehicle. That's what it is.
A communication vehicle. Okay, great. Multi-dimensional communication vehicle. All right. Okay. Other thoughts on so the job is to communicate something, is what you're saying. Communication. Yeah. Other thoughts on what job the brand does or what a brand should do?
It establishes trust.
Establishes trust with whom?
With audiences, stakeholders, pretty much everyone.
Okay, so this notion, great. So this notion that the brand establishes trust. So communication is one thing, right? That's the flow of information. But what you're talking about is something else. It's just creating an emotional connection and eliciting trust. And it's interesting because in the nonprofit sector, where there's a sort of dissociation between potentially who's paying for the product or service and those people experiencing the product and service, because there tends to be a disconnect, this notion of trust is actually really important, right? And the job of the brand is to create trust. Nice. Other thoughts on what brand can do beyond communication and trust? Yes?
Makes you known.
Makes you known, creates visibility.
Positive or negative.
Awareness, positive or negative. Okay, so is that different from communication?
Yes.
Okay. And then what's good about being well known? What's the benefit of that?
Depending on who you are.
Yeah.
So finding people, finding ideas from a foundation point of view.
Yeah, interesting. So the brand is not just about communicating something or eliciting emotional responses, but you want something to happen, right? And the brand can be like a magnet. A magnet in the sense that it's drawing people, ideas, collaborators, but you've got to be careful about what you're suggesting with your brand so that you're attracting either negative or positive reactions and connections. Great. Other thoughts on what the role that a brand plays?
Value proposition.
It communicates the value proposition.
It's basically uniqueness, the premiumness to your unique identity.
So this is an important point too, how unique it is. So the brand positions you relative to other people in your ecosystem and space. It helps identify you relative to others, right? And so this notion of the unique value proposition, which is kind of a traditional marketing branding term, is essentially one of the key roles the brand also plays. Other thoughts? Yes, sir?
You can use it to create internal alignment.
Beautiful. So I didn't know that until we did the research. The role of the brand internally to create cohesion is really, particularly in the nonprofit sector, and maybe somewhat in the service sectors, in the for-profit sector. But this notion of the brand and the brand audiences being internal and not just external, and the ability of the brand to provide cohesion so that people are really kind of invested and working towards the same kinds of objectives. Beautiful. Okay, I think I can just go home now. You guys have got it. We don't need to go on. But typically, this is not something not a role that the brand plays in the for-profit sector. And so part of the research and the reason why we did this research, which we did in collaboration actually with the Rockefeller Foundation, is to try to understand why the difference perhaps that the brand plays in the nonprofit sector. And one of the big differences is this internal role and this role of cohesion. So I'd say for both for-profits and nonprofits, there's a decision-making role. There's a shortcut to decision making. And back to the point that you made earlier about drawing people and people making decisions relative to that particular brand. And it is true that those brands with highest visibility, top of mind kind of brands, are the ones people make decisions to more quickly. So for example, when we have a natural disaster or some kind of emergency situation, funds will flow disproportionately to those organizations that have the highest top share of mind or visibility in the population. So it's a way of simplifying decision making. We talked about the role of communication and eliciting responses and emotions, for both for-profits and non-profits. That tends to be the role. And this notion of creating trust, and in the for-profit sector, it's really about loyalty, right? You're really trying to create a loyal customer base because the value is in sort of the repeat purchases and the loyalty of the customers. Slightly different in the non-profit sector. It's interesting that because maybe this is more of a foundation, a group of foundations, but for both non-profits and for-profits, the brand is a way of acquiring resources. And I'm not just talking about financial resources, but also human resources and partnerships and maybe access to different decision makers. So this notion that the brand is playing a role also to attract different forms of resources and not just financial resources. For nonprofits specifically, how that differs is that the brand is really, if you think about it in terms of who we are, what we do, and why it's important, the brand is both the embodiment and frankly, the articulation of the mission, right? The mission or the charter. And that's sort of very distinct from the for-profit sector. And then this notion of internal role that the brand plays in driving organizational cohesion is another major difference that we've seen. In the for-profit sector, the job of the brand is essentially to achieve competitive advantage, right? And so that you are in a situation where you're using your brand to create a competitive advantage so that the choice basically is for customers to flow to you so that you increase your market share and your profitability. This is not necessarily the goal of the brand in the nonprofit sector. And so we have to think carefully, given how we've defined the brand and the role that the brand plays, we've found that in the nonprofit sector, it's much more about positioning for clarity, both internal and external, and also positioning for partnerships and collaboration, right? And so there's a difference really in terms of that. So I'd like to share two things with you. The first is this notion of the role of brand cycle, and this is important because a brand is not static, right? And so I wanted to show this. We used to call this baby circles. But I work at Harvard, and that doesn't sound very academic. So it's actually called the role of the brand cycle, which sort of has more gravitas. But a couple of things to notice. The first thing to notice is that it's really nested, right? It's really nested in mission and values. But it's also part of organizational strategy, so that the brand is not a tool for communication, but really a strategic asset. And so in that respect, it really is part of organizational strategy. And then what you notice internally, the smaller circles have two parts to them. The green part is sort of the external perception, the image that we talked about, that results in trust and hopefully impact. And then the lighter blue side of the smaller circles is the more internal dimension. So the identity of the brand, how that builds cohesion that we talked about internally, and that drives capacity. And so the notion that your identity and your image is not static, because it is indeed driven by how people perceive you and experience the organization and the brand, and how you build capacity. And so this notion of building capacity is really embedded in the role of the brand cycle that we have here. So this is to say that the brand is not static, that it evolves over time, that it has two components to it, an internal and an external, and that these things work together. So this paradigm shift that we noticed, I want to acknowledge, so let me ask you this, who's kind of skeptical about brands? It's okay, I have very thick skin, and I've been in this for 10 years, and most people are like, don't talk to me about brand. There's some skepticism, all right, you don't have to put up your hand, but I know there is, right? So, and I think it's a healthy skepticism. When I started doing this work back in 2001, 2002, I would go to organizations, I talked about them, about their brand, and they'd say, no, we don't do brand here. Brand is not what we do. And there's still, I think, a pretty negative perception in the nonprofit sector in general, but maybe within foundations, that, we just don't do the brand thing here. We don't need money. Thank you very much. And we have a very nice reputation, and we just don't do the brand thing. And part of that skepticism, I think, is rooted in how people think about brand. If you think brand is a logo and is about fundraising, you're going to have a particular perception about what that brand is. Brand has a brand problem, right, in this sense. If you think about brand as just a logo and about fundraising or about public relations, then you're really going to think about it as a competitive positioning tool, right? And you're really sort of in this gray zone where the audience is either the donor or the community that you're trying to influence, and the communication is this sort of one-way download of information. This is who we are, this is why we're so great, and this is what you should do. But what we've seen is increasingly there are a number of nonprofit organizations that think about brand differently. They think about brand as essentially a strategic tool that helps them create mission impact, that really helps them further their mission, why they exist. It's who they are, what they do, and why it's important. And that shift permits them to think about brand very differently. And so the brand becomes not about a logo, and the audience is not just the donor, but it's really, I'd say, a spectrum of brand audiences, both internally and externally, that you have to motivate in order to achieve your mission, right? So that has implications for how we manage the brand, and it also has implications for what's necessary for brand management. So a lot of times I work with organizations that say, this brand thing is very nice, but really we're just small, we don't have the money, we don't have the expertise. And I'd say it really doesn't have to do with money and expertise, it really has to do with a mindset, right? Understanding what brand is and how it can further your organizational objectives is really a shift in mindset. And that, in fact, it's not just the communication department that should be dealing with brand, but in fact, everybody should really be thinking about brand as a key asset that helps them achieve what they want to achieve, right? And so this is sort of the shift that we're looking at. And it makes things a little bit more complicated, as everything in the nonprofit sector is much more complicated to manage a nonprofit organization than it is a for-profit organization. I think that's true. Maybe people differ, but I think just in terms of the breadth of stakeholders that you have to deal with and the complexity of the objectives that you have. So that's the paradigm shift that we're seeing. And I think, depending on where you are on the spectrum, you'll find within a single organization some people in the yellow zone and a bunch of people in the gray zone. So that there tends to be, this isn't just on an organizational basis, there are also individuals within organizations that sit on the two sides. And it's a transition. We're in transition here, I'd say. So building on that, the brand idea framework that builds on both the role of brand cycle that we talked about and this shift, this paradigm shift that we're observing, we sort of developed a framework that has three components to it. This first is this notion of brand integrity. So when I'm talking about integrity, I'm not necessarily talking about moral integrity although that's part of it, right? This notion of walking the walk and making sure that your organizational values are indeed aligned with your mission, so that you could, you're not working on sort of increasing democracy, and then within the organization you're like, no, I'm the boss and I'm going to tell you exactly what to do. So this notion of integrity is also structural integrity. And what I mean by structural integrity is that there is alignment between the brand identity, this internal perception of the brand, and the mission and the values, right? The stated mission and the stated values have to be reflected in this brand identity. It's really, that's where the brand identity takes its roots, in the mission and the values. And then there's a second alignment that needs to be made between brand identity, which we said was the internal perception of the brand, with this external perception of the brand. So that the alignment between identity and image is that second part, and often where things kind of fall apart, right? So particularly for organizations that have existed for a while, where activities have evolved over time, people's perceptions, people's image of the brand, of the organization tends to lag. And so what happens is that there is a disconnect, potentially, between the brand identity and the brand image. If I was to say to you, the World Wildlife Fund, brand, panda, what else? Conservation, species conservation. Any other sort of implicit brand associations with World Wildlife? So a lot of people think about the World Wildlife Fund as pandas, Siberian tigers, species conservation, and that's actually about 5% of what they do. So that they have evolved internally in their activities and in their brand identity to doing a lot more with land conservation, working with businesses to reduce their CO2 emissions. And yes, ultimately, that does have the result of species conservation, but it's not really what they do. So they have this challenge of a misalignment between their brand identity and their brand image. And so a lot of their work is to try to sort of bridge that and align and create integrity between identity and image. So that's sort of the goal, if you will, of brand management. And then this notion of brand democracy is how you go about achieving brand integrity, right? So traditionally, branding is a very hierarchical top-down thing. And so it's sort of defined by the top executives. This is our brand, and this is how you're going to talk about it. By the way, you can only use 12-point font Helvetica and sepia yellow. And what happens is that people have been managing brand in a lot of organizations have really been brand police people. Right? And so what they've been doing is, no, you can't use that photo, and you can't use this writing, and you can only use it. This is a complete waste of time. I'm just going to tell you how I really think about it. But this is actually a big waste of time, and we'll talk about some of the forces that make that a big waste of time. But social media is at the heart of a lot of this, right? So if you're spending all your time policing how people are talking about your organization, how your organization is being portrayed, you are missing a huge opportunity. And that opportunity for brand management is in this notion of developing brand ambassadors and being more democratic in terms of the management of your brand. So I don't mean voting, right? It's not a question of voting, but it's a question of engaging a variety of stakeholders in both the articulation, definition, and the communication of the brand. And so that you're not doing this top-down approach. This is how you talk about it. These are the images you're going to use. This is what you're going to do. And by the way, if you do something differently, I'm going to, I don't know, do something with a stick with you. This is really about engaging a number of different people in both the articulation and the communication of brand. So that what you're trying to do is create a variety of brand ambassadors that can talk about your brand in ways that make sense to them. So you're not trying to gain homogeneity, you're really trying to get engagement engaged brand ambassadors. And so that what you can do to provide some consistency, because that is important, is to provide a number of guidelines and tools that people can pull from rather than spending your time trying to increase or enforce strict controls. The third component is this notion of brand affinity. Remember, we talked about the fact that in the for-profit sector, we're trying to create competitive advantage relative to other players in the sector. Not so in our sector. We're actually trying to find and promote collaboration and partnership. So by definition, if that's what we're trying to do, we need to be able to use the brand to do that. And so thinking about using brand and brand assets to identify who to partner with and then to promote those collaborations is in fact what we want to do with the brand. And that is not something we do in the private sector. So to kind of sum it up, brand integrity is what you're trying to achieve, right? To create a strong brand. Brand democracy is the way you want to manage that brand so that you're really engaging a large number of brand ambassadors. And then brand affinity is what you want to do with that strong brand, which requires you to think very carefully about who you are so that you can identify key partners that will help you in implementing your mission. Sort of two fundamental drivers, right, behind this research. Social media is definitely one of them, and the increase in partnerships. So in the last couple of decades, we've seen a proliferation of partnerships, both cross-sector, a lot of work being done by a colleague, or has been done by a colleague of mine, Jim Austin, on cross-sector collaborations. Please look that up if you're interested in that field. He just came out with another book. Not that I get any thing on that, but Austin is a really good reference for cross-sector collaborations, but also increasing number of intra-sector collaborations, right? Typically, a nonprofit, and particularly a foundation, will have dozens of partnerships and collaborations. And so this, if you will, this drive for collaboration is what's one of the things that's behind the brand idea, or was driving the brand idea. So social media really means that instead of having a one-way download of information, basically you cannot control what people are saying about you, right? And so you want to give that control up, and you want to create some brand ambassadors that help manage that. And so it really builds on this notion of transparency as well that we've talked about before. So to summarize, I'm not, how am I doing on time? So 2 minutes, okay, great. So I'll speak really, really fast. Brand integrity, no. So brand integrity, the key here is to know who you are, what you do, and why it matters. So this notion of self-reflection in order to be able to partner more effectively, right? You cannot partner more you cannot identify who to partner with unless you have great clarity on what it is, who you are, what you're trying to achieve, and what your particular strengths are, right? And this notion of alignment is key. Alignment with your mission and your vision and your values, but also trying to get alignment between identity and image. Democracy is a process. It's a process of engagement, of actively engaging stakeholders, both internal and external, and trying to create, and I hate the word empower, but it's one of those words that people really like, but really trying to encourage brand ambassadors, so that it's not you talking about your organization in a systematic and rather sort of Cartesian fashion, but really trying to elicit participation and engagement by brand ambassadors. And then brand affinity is this idea that you really, by the way, in order to achieve your mission, you do have to work with others. And you will only be as successful, and it's going back to this notion of dissemination as well, you're only successful if you make others successful. So this notion of collaboration and promoting partnership and using the brand to achieve that is really important. And when you look at the relationship between foundation and their grantees, that is really sort of an interesting relationship. The last presentation sort of ended with some successful investments, right, if we want to use the language of investments, because the success or the brand of those individuals reflect on the foundation's brand as well. So the relationship between the brands really and this positive spillover effects are really intriguing. So partly foundations, I think, are already in this paradigm shift. They know it's not about the money. They know that brand is not about the money and that it's really about implementing the mission. So they're all kind of naturally already sort of working in the new paradigm, if you will. And they understand this notion of brand affinity. Most of you cannot achieve your mission without working through your grantees, right, and other partners. And so understanding that there is some positive brand spillovers between your organization and your partners or brands as well is really important. So I'm maybe over time, so let me take a step back and maybe answer any questions, if you have any. Yes, sir.
How do you bring some credibility to the brand? Solidity or credibility to the brand, how important? Or how can you bring that?
How you bring credibility to the brand?
Solidity.
And solidity to the brand. So remember that brand is a series of perceptions, right? And that lives in the minds of different brand stakeholders. So consistency between your actions and your words, creating trust is what's going to, over time, create, and this notion of legitimacy also kind of builds into that. So over time, being consistent and making sure that you're walking the walk and talking the talk, I think is really important to creating trust, which is a foundation for that. And so kind of going back to the role of brand cycle, that's sort of one way to think about that, I think. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Søren Peter Olsen, Carlsberg Foundation.
Yeah.
I was wondering, to your experience, if you sharpen the brand of an organization, who are the best people to do that? I mean, I think we have seen catastrophes like in Denmark, the second largest city here wanted a new branding, and they came up with Aarhus is Danish for Progress, which made no sense whatsoever. And I think many have tried that you let professional people analyze what you are about, and then they come up with something that doesn't make much sense. Whereas you, sitting in the organization, may have a better feeling of what's going on. But
Beautiful.
Of course, it's an interaction, but how have you experienced, what's the input, who gives the input, who has the best sense of what the organization is about?
So let me apologize to all the consultants in the room.
Good, thank you.
But the first thing is not to hire a consultant. And actually, you need to do the work yourself, right? And so to answer your question, it has to come from a lot of hard work internally. And this is the process of brand democracy. And you cannot have a consultant come in and say, this is what your brand is. It has to come through dialogue with a lot of stakeholders, a lot of internal stakeholders, but also external stakeholders, so that you can really work on your identity, who you are, what you do, why it's important. And you can only get that through this sort of process of democracy. And the other thing is, if you don't do this, use this process of democracy, which, by the way, I hate to tell you, is a lot of hard work and a lot of time, but you cannot create brand ambassadors if you don't create this sort of engagement of a variety of stakeholders in answering those three questions, right? So the quick answer is don't hire the consultants. So I apologize to consultants.
Thanks, Nathalie. It's great to see how these ideas have evolved. I can remember back when we put out the RFP for this important question, and your team came out with some provocative thinking. I'll make a quick comment and ask you the question. I work at the Rockefeller Foundation, and one thing we actively manage actually is multiple brands. So we work with the United Nations and that whole governmental space, and we need to create a brand and have people who represent that, and then all the way to social entrepreneurs who work very differently, and we want to have an attractive brand for them. So I'm curious, as you've done this research, one of the themes you've articulated is that of consistency. what are the things you feel need to be most consistent, and what are the dimensions that can vary? Because we interact in so many different areas, and I think that's probably relevant to lots of the foundations here too.
So I think that's a good, so you're talking about this notion of brand portfolio as well as perception by different brand audiences, right? And so I have to say I don't know for brand portfolios. So a lot of organizations will have a couple of different brands, often tied to particular programs or with respect to particular brand audiences. My gut tells me that you're better off with a single brand. Because you can actually spread your resources and your energy and your consistency on one brand. But I don't know if that's true. I haven't done the research to really do that. In the for-profit sector, there is a move away from a portfolio of brands to much more of a corporate brand. And those, I think, are for some financial considerations as well. So I don't know the answer in terms of the portfolio of brand. What I have seen is an increasing number of umbrella brands, which can actually embrace a number of different organizations. So there has been this sort of brands like the Girl Effect, for example, which is a brand that was created as an umbrella brand to kind of promote collaboration and cooperation. So I have seen that. In terms of different perceptions of an organization's brand because of different audiences, I think you can get consistency. And that really means you need to anchor in the mission and the values. Although you can be attracted to a brand for different reasons because you're coming from a different perspective, I think it's dangerous if you are actually communicating or eliciting different responses with one single brand. So I really think you really need to be as consistent as possible. And the easiest way to do that, and the most authentic way to do that, is to be anchored in the mission and the values, so that you know who you are, what you do, and why it's important, right? And it's really kind of fundamental. And how that is perceived by different audiences, you know, can somewhat differ. But you have to be very consistent internally in terms of your brand identity, I think. Good. Yeah.
Thank you. It was really interesting. I'm Mark Henderson from the Wellcome Trust. We have a similar challenge to Rockefeller on that, and one of the ways we're thinking through that is kind of, are we a brand that is kind of more like the BBC, where you have a lot of different products produced by the BBC that still have a kind of essential BBC-ness to them, or are we a brand more like Diageo, where you can't buy a Diageo, you buy a Guinness or a Johnny Walker or whatever. And I mean, my personal view is we're much more like the BBC than like Diageo, but different people will probably come out with different solutions to that depending on what you do. The other thing I wanted to mention, I mean, you said earlier that the mistake to have brand just as a function of communications, which I absolutely agree with. We actually went a sort of strategic error further than that a while ago by putting brand not only in communications but also with design explicitly, the result of which is that internally there became a perception that it was all about logo and all about rules and policing and so on, as opposed to that expression and embodiment of who you are, your mission, what you're trying to achieve. And I mean, we're unwinding that at the moment, but...
You probably had some consultants work with you before. I'm just kidding. Trust me. Yeah. Good, great, yeah, nice, good comments, yeah. Yes, sir. The erosion of value?
Yeah, because what does it take to really erode value?
Oh, yes, okay, good, yeah.
Because we've seen in the past 30 years, we've seen Exxon and British Petroleum, those small oil spills.
Yeah.
Well, they probably eroded most of the value. But
yeah.
What does it really take to be effective here?
Yeah, and you're specifically in the non-profit sector. So here's the really interesting thing. Non-profit brands are kind of boring. And the reason is we don't really want to upset anybody. We just want to be nice and everybody to like us. And I think that is an error, actually. I think if we're sort of vanilla in the kind of sea of sameness and niceness and kind of do-gooders and everybody likes us, that's really been our MO. But in fact, I think the edgier we are, the more we stand for something. And that carries, I think, both risks and rewards. I must say that increasingly part of CSR, and I'm very for, I think it's really important to have these cross-sector partnerships, but I would say one of the risks is partnering too strongly with a corporate brand that for some reason or other goes south. And that can have a negative brand spillover, and that might be one of the riskiest things. And also, you don't want to choose, you know, like a lot of corporate brands that choose very well-known people to represent them, and that can also get a little bit difficult, right? So it's been interesting examples of non-profit brands that have been aligned and had very strong, really well-known brand ambassadors who have done things that are not particularly good, and those organizations, and I'm thinking of Oxfam in particular, have asked those brand ambassadors no longer to be their brand ambassadors. So you have to have a little courage to be able to do that. So I think in terms of risk to the brand value or the brand equity, one of the biggest risks, I think, for nonprofits is partnering with the wrong corporation or the wrong individual. And that would erode value, yeah.